Torah Resource is made possible through the generous donations of people like you. If you would like to help us continue to produce this kind of material, please consider making a donation at TorahResource.com. Okay, another Torah portion, another week, and today we will be looking at Terumah, contributions. So Exodus 25:1 through 27:19, the associated passages is 1 Kings 5:26 through 6:13 and 1 Corinthians 6:12 through 20. And then, of course, we do have Rosh Chodesh readings this week as well. And if you're watching this later, then that won't make any difference. But I will, it's Shabbat Shekalim, which is what we have extra readings for as well. So on Shabbat Shekalim, the Sabbath of the Shekel, it is Exodus 30:11 through 16, and 2 Kings 12:1 through 17 are the readings. But we're not going to cover those. We're just covering today Exodus 25:1 through 27:19. If you'd like the list that I'm looking at right now, you can find it on TorahResource.com. You can also find notes on this specific Torah portion at TorahResource.com. You can also find the book of my father, Tim Hagg's notes on Exodus and the entire Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, on TorahResource.com. Okay, so this week we look at Terumah, which is offerings. A lot going on in this passage, and I will be completely honest with you, Rob. I read this, but I read probably about 80% of it in Hebrew, which means that I probably didn't get most of it. I was, when I read in Hebrew, I'm way more focused on just trying to understand what the words are supposed to be and what it's saying.
I love it.
So it's not like I really, absorbed the passage, but
well, and when we read it over and over, and we still don't get it all. That's
right.
Was that a punt over to me? Because I have a lot.
Sure.
This just big picture. What is so awesome here is the creator of the universe is moving towards his covenant people in a way that is like magnificent, glorious, holy, and absolutely terrifying at the same time. He, and like, if you look, I'm just looking down at verse 8. So 25 verse 8, Asuli Mikdash, they will make for me it's Mikdash. It has the word kadosh in it, right? A tabernacle, and often that's translated sanctuary.
A holy place.
We see two words here, Mishkan and Mikdash. They will make for me a Mikdash. Centers on it being a holy place.
Right.
When it says Mishkan, that's from Shakan, a dwelling place. So we see both. So if you're using your English Bibles and you see, what's the difference between they will make for me a tabernacle or they will make for me a sanctuary? Is that just different English interpretations of the same Hebrew word? Probably not. It depends on the English translation, but the two key Hebrew terms are Mikdash. That's often sanctuary because it coming from sanctus, right? The Latin word, holy, a holy place. And then Mishkan is usually tabernacle, but it means a dwelling place. But in 25:8, Vasuli Mikdash Veshakanti Betocham, and I will dwell in their midst. And then verse 9, and this is a passage that Stephen in Acts 7 mentions. It's in the epistle to the Hebrews,
1 Corinthians
where it
6,
says,
right?
According to all that I show you as the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furniture, so you shall construct it. Pardon me. And why is this? It means God's bringing the plans, right? God has the plans already exist. God is not inventing them. Moses is not inventing them God isn't inventing them on the spot. They're already an expression of what is fitting for his holiness and is dwelling in the, and here's the crazy part, the terrifying part, in the midst of a world that's full of sin and death, and thus impurity. So when you take the helicopter straight up and you look at like, what is happening here? The Creator is saying, I'm going to dwell in a world full of sin and death without compromising my holiness. And here's how it looks. This is exactly, it has to be to spec. You can't change. And that's why where it says my Terumah, he gives the list of things that you're going to need. Here's what you're going to need. There's no other ingredients in all creation that are going to, any other materials that are going to, they can't substitute, platinum for the gold or
tin for copper.
Yeah. It's like, this is the spec. And guess what? The people are going to bring it of their own, their hearts are going to stir, and they're going to bring all this stuff.
Yeah. So what you're
talking. So even
about,
if a guy had, well, I have good intentions, I have this tin pot, I think maybe they can use it. It's like, no. It's according to God's spec. And if we kind of fast forward a little bit, we see at the end of Exodus, it says, and they made it to spec, right? They made it exactly as the Lord had commanded Moses. So they made it. And the glory of the Lord fills that tabernacle. And why that is terrifying is because now the charge of the priests is to protect that holiness. Because if a stranger tries to come in and infiltrate that holiness, they don't go to trial. There's no inquiry. They get killed. Like they're put to death on the spot. Like anyone who would try to break this this domain, to infiltrate on this holy domain, would be put to death by the priests. And of course, we have the inauguration then of all the blood sacrifice, like the daily, all the things that are going to allow this to, for God's holy presence to remain, is a protection that the priests are obligated to do to protect Israel from God's wrath.
Yeah.
So God is expressing his holiness, and his wrath is not for, I mean, we see it if we look into the book of Leviticus, like when Nadav and Abihu infiltrate into this space, they get fried instantly. So the idea is there's a terror here. I know I'm jumping ahead to like later Exodus, Leviticus, but just to kind of help us sink in and allow the gravity of what are the implications of God saying, build for me a place where my holiness will dwell. And that's good news and bad news. It's good news for those who love God, right? But it's also a call to to walk in holiness. And for those who hate him, it's not good news at all.
Okay, so I want to reel back to something that you said at the very, very beginning of all that. So the idea of God dwelling with his people, and this is what, I've written a lot on this recently. There's a article that's going to be published in a book that's forthcoming which is a melding of a bunch of different authors. But my piece was on sin sacrifice, and ultimately on the idea of what does the sacrifices accomplish? And I was juxtaposing the idea of eternal salvation and justification as opposed to temporal cleanliness. And when we see God come into a world that is tainted with sin, you have to have a space that is not tainted with sin, right? And this is exactly what we see here. There's this separation, and to be able to enter into this space, you can't have sin. And so sin in this world taints us somehow in a physical way that we can't see and that we can't maybe even understand fully. But when we enter into that space, something has to take that away. And this is what the physical sacrifices do physically in our space. They're also, of course, pointing to what Christ would do on the cross and the eternal justification that we have. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 6:14 and following. This is what he says. He says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore go out from their midst and be separated from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. Since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, bringing holiness to completion in the fear of God." So we see this.
Wow.
We see this separation within the physical and the spiritual, right? We separate from unholiness when it comes to the spiritual realm. But in the physical realm, we also have to realize that when God creates this space, there has to be a separation of unholy from holy. And that is done through specific means which God gives us. And we see this in the sacrificial system.
We see it spatially, like there's the Holy of Holies.
Right.
And then we see it in terms of a priestly hierarchy, that
yes,
when it is time to go, and temporally. So you see it spatially. Every day priests can minister in the holy place, but there's a curtain there, and they know what's on the other side, even though they've never seen it. And the fear of God is in their heart because of what that is. And then temporally, that means once a year. And then hierarchically, right, the high priest only will go into that place. So but there's bloodshed every single day. There are burnt offerings, the lamb morning and evening, like every day. It doesn't matter if it's a Sabbath. It could be whatever day. There is burnt offerings that continue. They call it the tamid because it's the continual offering. And then there are subsequent offerings and et cetera, based on some obligatory, based on, is it a Sabbath? Is it a new moon? Is it a festival day? And then there are the voluntary offerings. Is it burnt offerings of worship? Is it a fellowship offering? Is it a sin offering? So all these things are part of God's wise design. And in Parashat Terumah, we have the entryway into that whole world of the priesthood is, and the reason it's called Terumah is also miraculous because it means it's the people the verb is to lift up. Ram is the lifting up. And the idea is that it's the people are lifting up something to God, but he says it's my terumah. Before they even bring it, he says it's mine. And then he says that their hearts will move them to bring it. And you have to ask, wait a minute, is there a world where God's going to say, tell them to bring my terumah, and they bring all the wrong stuff? Then God would be like, well, I guess, man, what am I going to do? I guess I can't. They're not going to build a sanctuary for me. No. So how does it both work? How does God say, have them bring my terumah? Their hearts are going to move them to bring it. And then in fact, their hearts do move them, stir them to bring it, and they bring it, and it's what he wanted. How do both those things true unless it's the Spirit of God stirring the hearts of the people who bring it? They get credit for bringing it. They get credit for building it. But just as we see later when God says, yeah, and the people who are going to do the fine craftsmanship, guess what? I've given them the Spirit of God. I've given them the spirit of wisdom. I've given them a spirit to be able to teach. Like it's God moving humans to accomplish God's design. There's no world where God comes down and says, hey, Moses, here's the list of, here's my materials list to build this house. Go just see what you can do. And Moses shows up. Well, we got some 2x4s and some old rusty nail. Like People don't really care that much, Lord, these days. Sorry.
That
it's
reminds
not
me,
that.
It reminds me of me building my office. I built this whole office up from YouTube, right? It was like I watched a YouTube video. I was like, yeah, I can do that, and then I did it. And I'd go to Home Depot to find the part that I saw on YouTube, and it would be like, well, I can't find that part, but I found this part, and I think it'll work. Right, the whole thing's slapped together with like duct tape, man.
Like MacGyver, we used to call it
exactly.
MacGyvering.
I just from I completely agree
so
with what
God got it the way it was built precisely as the pattern was revealed. How does that happen? Unless God makes the hearts of those people bring those things. There's humans just don't do what God wants. Right? Without him.
Well, Israel, we see that in Israel. Just before this, Israel erects a golden calf. I mean,
right. I mean, when they start building it, yeah, that's right. And he still gets it.
Yeah, just from a Hebrew perspective, this was this to me. You have all this narrative, which is easy reading in Hebrew for the Hebrew students out there. You have all this narrative that comes in the Hebrew, super easy reading, and it's really fun to read those. And then all of a sudden, you come into this passage. You come into 25, and one of the things, there's different ways that we can read. We can read just from our VHS. We can read from the computer where you can hover over and you can see what the word means. It's almost like cheating, right? But I have a Hebrew reader, and the Hebrew reader is nice. It doesn't have any translation in it, but if I don't know what the word count is. It's like if the word is used less than 50 times in the Tanakh,
50 or less,
it'll tell you, it'll tell you what the word is. I mean, there's just numbers all over this passage. There's not, you need to know your colors. You need to know your numbers. You need to know, you need to know. There's a lot of vocabulary in here that isn't used often in the text, and it's not easy reading because it's all about building. So
and measurements and
all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But it's like Moses is getting a YouTube video direct from God.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, the nice thing is,
careful you make it now every once in a while, because he's like, okay, be sure to do it the way
you stumble over. You'll stumble for those reading in Hebrew. You'll stumble over, or who don't know Hebrew as a first language. You'll stumble over a lot of the words in 25. But by the time you get to 27, you've used these words now so many times. It's like, okay, I recognize. So take heart. It gets better. All right. Anything else before we go? I don't see a lot of people using this as their passage for devotionals, on a normal Bible study day. But clearly this passage tells us something about God. It clearly tells us something about his holiness. And it clearly, I think, points us to the Messiah, right? The need to be able to be in space with the God that we're in covenant with. How do we do that? Well, in eternity, we can only do that through the shed blood of Christ. And all of these things point to that. To be able to come into the physical space is a picture of coming into eternal space with God.
Well, and Moses is, we get this twice, right? This is Moses on the mountain. Moses is getting this vision from God for 40 days and 40 nights, and he's not eating or drinking, right? And of course, this is miraculous, right? He's being physically sustained and spiritually sustained by his proximity to God. However, if that mysterious situation is, happening, it's happening by God's will, and for a purpose that we could call incarnational. It has to do with God dwelling in the midst of his people. And ultimately, the incarnation that the tabernacle conveys is Yeshua, like you're saying. And Yeshua had 40 days and 40 nights parallel in the wilderness. And of course, he is, he didn't have to be on a mountain, right? And he is the Torah made flesh, right? He's the Word become flesh, as you mentioned. So Yeah, a lot of good stuff here.
All right. We'll be back next week for another one. We hope that these are a blessing to you. And you can find all the resources that we've been using on TorahResource.com. Go there and check it out. We'll see you next week.